Number 11 is where we're going to be today. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 through 16 is where we're going to be focusing in on today. This past week, I was kind of laughing. Me and Cass, we saw some little babies in the store the other day. And it kind of got me thinking back when Arella was just a little baby. And I remember when she was just a little baby, she had real bad reflux. And so she would just cry for hours and hours on end. Love her to death, but man, I don't miss those times. But when she was just a baby, she would just cry. And I remember one day she was crying and was just crying and crying. And I said, Rella, whatever you want, I'll give it to you. Just stop crying. I was like, Rella, if you want food, I'll give you food. If you want a toy, I'll give you a toy. I said, here's my checkbook. Name an amount. Just name it and I'll sign it and it's yours and we'll be done with this. Now, Cass told me a few important things I learned that day. She said, number one, you cannot bargain with a baby. You just can't do it. You can't bargain with a baby. And the second thing she told me was, you've got to be careful. Whatever you promise our children, you have to deliver. Whatever you promise our children, you have to deliver. She said that is so vital. If your kids are going to trust you, whatever you promise them, you have to deliver. You have to follow through with that. And so today, this morning, we're continuing talking about faith. And we're focusing in on primarily faith in God's promises. When God makes a promise to us, knowing that He will be faithful. When God makes a promise to us, we can trust that, we can embrace that truth, knowing God will fulfill that promise. God will do it. God is faithful to His promises. And so we'll be looking in Hebrews chapter 11, and we've been walking through the book of Hebrews for several months now, and we said very simply the book of Hebrews was written to Jewish believers, and their struggle was wanting to go back, right? They wanted to go back to the Old Testament ways of worshiping God, of following God, and so the first 10 chapters was all about Jesus is greater, right? All the Old Testament, that was good, that was God's design, God had a purpose, but Jesus is greater. Don't go back, press forward in your faith. And how do we do that? We have to walk by faith. That was the key. So we got to chapter number 11, and it's a great faith chapter of the Bible, right? We said we looked at the description of faith, what faith does for us. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, right? Our faith in Jesus is not just wishful thinking. We don't just say, well, I hope, I wish that I will go to heaven one day. No, we know that we will go to heaven one day. Why? Because our faith gives us substance. It gives us support for the hope that we have in Jesus. It's the foundation for what we have in Jesus. We said our faith is all about confidence. Confidence in Jesus, that we know Jesus will do what He said He's going to do. We says that our faith is the evidence of things not seen. It's that conviction and convicting proof. We have certainty that even though we cannot see it right now, we know that it's true. We absolutely know that it's true. It's the evidence of things not seen. We said by faith, the elders obtained a good report. Said God is asking the same thing of you that He did the Old Testament heroes. God is testifying of them. They were struggled. They were men and women who had doubts, who had fears, who had to wrestle with all this, but they had faith in God. I'm asking you to do the same thing. You walk by faith. Have faith and confidence in God. It's the only way we can please God. It's the only way is to walk by faith. And so we started looking at these examples of faith. We talked about Abel's worship. We talked about Enoch's walk. We talked about Noah last week when no one believed him. When everyone said he's crazy, he had faith in God. What God said He was going to do, he believed it and he acted out on it. And so we have to have that same faith. And so today we're going to be looking at examples of faith of those who trusted in the promises of God. Those who trusted in the promises of God. So let's hop right into it. Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 8. Hebrews chapter 11, verse number 8 is where we're going to be today. And we're going to look at the first 3 words of Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, and then we'll break it down. It says, by faith, Abraham. We start off the same way that we started off all these other examples. By faith, through confidence in God, now let's look at Abraham's life. Through confidence in God, let's look and study about Abraham's life. Now remember, who was the book of Hebrews written to? It was written to Jewish believers. And so when Jewish believers, when they hear that name Abraham, there's red flags going up, right? Not only is he a hero of the faith, he's the patriarch of the nation, right? And so talking about Abraham, there's a lot of emphasis, there's a lot of importance placed on him. So by faith, Abraham, and let's remember what Abraham was all about. We read about him in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. It says, "Now the Lord God said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and will make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse them that curse thee, and in thee shall all the families of the earth be blessed." And so what do we see about Abraham? When we're first introduced to him in Genesis chapter 12 right there, God made a covenant with Abraham. Remember, this is that Jewish audience right there. And he says, this man who lived in the land of Ur, who was, before God spoke to him, was a worshiper of the moon. That was Abraham before he came and God called him. He worshipped the moon with his father in those generations before him. And there was nothing great about him. There was, in fact, nothing great about the nation of Israel that God would choose them. But God was going to show the world His glory and His nature through the descendants of Abraham. So everything that we're talking about Abraham has to deal with this promise, this covenant that God made to Abraham. So by faith, everything Abraham does is because he believes the promises of God. And notice what God said. God said, "I will be your God and I will make you a great nation." Everything that happens in Abraham's life is because of God. It's not because of him. Not what he accomplishes, not what he does, but what God does. God was going to make him a great nation. God was the one who was going to bless him. It was all God. And so Abraham and the nation of Israel just had to have faith and obey and be blessed. And those that cursed him would be cursed, and those that blessed him would be blessed. And so what do we see? By faith, Abraham obeyed. He trusted God's promises. He believed God. Now, what I love, as we get ready to break down these next few verses, we say that and we say, okay, I know that Abraham walked by faith, right? Abraham left his family. But what I love the book of Hebrews, what it does right here, is going to take that understanding to a whole new level. He says, yes, he left and he trusted God's promises, but look at the depths of everything and all the circumstances surrounding Abraham's faith. Look at the greater level that we see right here. Look what he goes on to say. He says in verse number 8, he says, "By faith Abraham," listen, "when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance." Which he should after receive for an inheritance. God says, I want you to go to a place. Understand this. When Abraham left, he was not given the promise that this land would be his. You with me? When God called Abraham in those first 3 verses, he simply said, go. Go where I show you. Now when Abraham left, he had no clue. There was no promise that God was going to give him in this land. So all he knew that he was going to some place and he didn't know what he was going to do when he got there. You with me? He had no clue what he was going to do when he got there. He had no clue what it was going to be like. But he had faith in God. God said, go, and I will make you a great nation. He had no clue what that was going to look like, no clue how that was going to play out, but he trusted God. God did not promise the land unto Abraham until he gets there. It wasn't until verse number 7 in Genesis chapter 12, when he got to the land, that God would said, I will make you a great nation, and I will give this land that you're at right now to your descendants, to your children. So listen, Abraham left not knowing where he was going to stay. He left not knowing what he was going to do when he got there. He had no clue. All God said was, I'm going to make you a great nation, now go. And he trusted God. Do you see even the deeper levels of Abraham's faith? No clue what was going to happen when he got there. God did not promise him, this will be your land. All he knew was God said go, and so he went. An even deeper level of his understanding. This strange land he didn't know was going to be his home. To add on top of that, at this time he was 75. He had no children, and God was going to make him a great nation. How was that going to happen? And so let's go on. Look what he goes on to say. He says, by faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance. He didn't know when he left. It wasn't until he got there that God told him, this will be your land. And so he goes on to say, obeyed. He trusted God and he acted out on faith. And look what he says. And he went out not knowing whether he went. You with me? Do you see the depths of his faith right there? He didn't know what he was going to do when he got there, and he didn't know where he was going. He had no clue. God didn't tell him, listen, you're going to go to such and such spot, and it's going to take you this long to get there. This is what you need to pack. Here's your trip. Here's your plan all lined out. He had no clue where he was going. I mean, he was blind in all of this, absolutely just trusting God that God was going to take him where he needed to go. No clue. Didn't know what was up ahead. If you study that trip out, that's about 400 miles Abraham had to travel. That's not a quick little trip. And he had no clue where he was going. In fact, part of that, it goes across the Arabian desert. He had no clue where he was going, no clue what he was going to do when he got there. But God said go, and he trusted him. God said he's going to make him a great nation. I don't know how that's going to work. I don't even know where I'm going. But I trust God. I believe God. When God made me a promise, I'm going to do it. I'm going to follow. And that's what he did. He had no clue where he was going. And yet he did it. You see the depths of his faith? And then you remember in Genesis chapter 12, he says, you're going to leave your kindred and leave your father's house. Now understand, in those days, a man's inheritance was everything to him. People didn't travel along like we do a whole lot and start new lives. You didn't see that a whole lot. You'd stay on your father's land. You'd stay on your father's house. You would take in his inheritance and you would keep going. That's how you would survive. He says, I want you to leave everything you've ever known. All the comforts and safeties and securities of home, leave all of that. Leave all of your earthly inheritance that it means nothing to you, and you come for what I have for you. What a huge step of faith. Didn't know where he was going, didn't know what he was going to do when he got there. But listen, oftentimes in our lives, God leads us to give up security. He leads us to give up familiar surroundings to carry out his will. And Abraham understood wherever God is leading, had no clue. Wherever God is leading is the only place he's going to find joy, peace, direction, and fulfillment of God's promises. So listen, guys, we talk about taking steps of faith. Sometimes that means God's going to lead you to step out of everything that gives you comfort, everything that makes you feel secure, everything that makes you feel at home. But he trusted God because he knew no matter how great his home was, how great that family inheritance was going to be, the only place he was going to find fulfillment of God's promises was wherever he led him. He had no clue what it was. No clue where that was going to lead him. No clue what he was going to do when he got there. No clue how it was going to work out. But God said it. I trust him. Y'all see the depths of Abraham's faith? Y'all see the depths of how much he was convicted, how much he was convinced God was going to fulfill his promise. I don't know how it's going to work out, but I trust him. Left everything. And then look what he goes on to say in verse number 9. He says, by faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, and heirs with him of the same promise. Once again, how does this verse start off? By faith, right? In confidence in God, believing God, and acting out in that belief. Look what he did. By faith, he sojourned. We see that word in Scripture a few times, don't we? This idea of sojourn. What it means is to reside as a foreigner, to be a stranger. Remember, he stayed in the promised land, but that promised land wasn't his yet, was it? God promised, I'm going to give this land to your children. It never belonged to Abraham. It never belonged to Abraham. It wasn't his land. It wasn't his home. He stayed there as a foreigner. He stayed there as a sojourner. He stayed there as one who had no rights, who had no claim to the land, that he couldn't say, this is my land, this is where I'm going to set up my house. He didn't have those deep roots. He stayed there as a sojourner. He stayed there as a foreigner without rights of any citizenship. And so he says, he dwelled in these tabernacles. He lived in these tabernacles. He lived in these tents or these cloth huts, this temporary habitations. We understand and know tents are not made to be long-time residents. A few years ago when we went to buy our house, we came to Marla and we said, Marla, we'd like to find a house. She didn't take us to the camping section of Walmart, right? She didn't say, hey, this is a great 4-person tent right here that you can set up in the middle of Chickasha. No, because tents are not made or not designed to be permanent dwellings, are they? Permanent residents. And so when Abraham left, he lived in tents his whole life there. He stayed there as a sojourner, as a foreigner who didn't have any claim, any right to that land. But he stayed there until the day that he died. He lived in tents and never saw the land become the nation of Israel. In fact, where do we see Abraham getting in trouble? When he tries to leave the promised land, right? Twice he goes to Egypt and tries to leave there, and what happens? He gets into a lot of trouble. Has to say his sister is his wife. That's not a good situation to be in, okay? And so, twice he leaves there. But the entire time he is there, he never builds his residence. He never has these deep roots. But he stays living in tents, waiting for the promise of God. God promised him, I'm going to make you a great nation. God promised him, this land I'm going to give to that nation that I will promise you. But the entire time he lived there, he never saw the fulfillment of that. The entire time he lived there, he stayed in tents. His entire life, staying there, living in these tents, because he believed in the promise. He believed God's promise. And so it says that Isaac and Jacob, heirs with the same promise, they lived in tents also. Why? Because God made the same promise to them. Now, if you remember, Abraham had other sons, right? Of course, we think of Ishmael. Then he had 6 other sons with his wife after Sarah had died. All these other sons, but the promise was made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. And so that entire time, when all of his other sons could make residence, they could build homes, they can start their own little nation, they can start their own little city, the promised people lived in tents. Because God promised them that one day he was going to give this land to them. And they were waiting for it. They were waiting for it. We see that in verse number 10. Look what he goes on to say. He says, for he looked for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Don't you love that right there? Look what he says. He says, he looked for a city. That word looked, what it literally means is he waited. Why did Abraham not leave? Why did he not just say, I'm going to try to build my own nation, my own city? Because he was waiting for God's promise. He was waiting. Guys, listen to me. With faith, it means at times we have to wait. Let me come talk to you guys for a second, all right? With faith, it means at times we have to wait. One of the big things we've been talking about is taking steps of faith, right? So many times that means there's things God has been pressing on my life, things that God is pressing in my heart, that I need to do it, right? I need to take this step of faith. I need to start reading my Bible more. I need to talk to that person about Jesus Christ. God may be sending me off to the mission field. I need to take those steps of faith. I need to do something. Sometimes faith means we wait. We wait for God's fulfillment of his promises in his time. We have to wait. Sometimes God may be leading us. God may have made a promise to us, a covenant with us. He's working in our hearts, and he says, now wait. Do you have the faith to obey me while you're waiting? Do you have enough faith in me that even though I don't bring it right to your attention right then, right there, that you know I am going to be faithful, that I will fulfill this promise? Sometimes faith means to wait. Why did they live in those tents for all those years? Because God made them a promise, and they were waiting for God to fulfill that promise. The times they tried to handle it on their own ended up in a mess, right? But when they waited on God, they lived in those tents, those uncomfortable tents, those temporary dwellings, because they were waiting for God to fulfill His promise. Sometimes we have to wait. But we know, even if we're waiting, God is faithful. You know what we call that? That's evidence of things not seen. Right? It's evidence of things not seen. So what were they doing? They were waiting. They looked for a city which had foundations. You think about that just for a second? Man, that makes a lot of sense. These guys spending so much time living in tents, they wanted a home with a foundation, right? They wanted a home that they could build off of. They wanted a home, something that they can build and be strong and be steady and be sure. So they wanted a home which had good foundations. But not only that, he says they looked for a city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. That God was the one who's going to bring it all about. That God was the one who's going to make this city, make their home what it is. Now listen. When God does fulfill His promise, and you go back and you study Jerusalem under King David and Solomon, listen, it's glorious, is it not? And you go back and you study Israel's history. That's what the Old Testament is Israel, is God interacting in that covenant and being faithful to His promise. And how everything, God did it. God did it. How did they get from slaves in Egypt? God delivered them. How did they make it through the wilderness and survive? God led them and provided for them. When they got to the promised land, how did they conquer all those cities? How did they conquer and become the nation of Israel? God delivered them. God did it all. It was God working. God promised. And so here's what they said. That these patriarchs, we have Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, they weren't looking for what they could just accomplish on their own. They wanted a foundation that God has built upon, that God has laid. And the nation of Israel is a nation that God has laid. God did the work. It wasn't them. It wasn't how great they are. The little walls of Jericho things wasn't because they were so loud on that seventh day the walls came tumbling down. That was a work of God. God did the work. And so that's what they're waiting for. They're waiting for it. For God to do the work. And we'll see when we get to verse number 16 that we're looking even beyond that. I can't wait till we get to verse 16. So it goes on to say, we get to verse number 11, but there was still a big question that he had to deal with. There was still a big question that Abraham was wrestling with. And that was a question of how. How is this all going to work? How is God going to make him a great nation? When the time he was called at the age of 75 in Genesis chapter 12, he was 75 years old, didn't have any children. How? How would God make it work? We see this in verse number 11. I love this. Look what it says. It says, through faith. We begin the same way, right? Through confidence in God, through believing in God. Look what he says. Through faith, also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed, and was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him. Who's him? It's God. Because she judged God faithful who had promised. Let's break that down. I love that verse right there. Through faith, through confidence in God, it says Sarah. Who was Sarah? That was Abraham's wife. Now remember, he was called at 75. He doesn't have a child for 25 more years. 25 more years. After he left and goes to the promised land, 25 more years of waiting for God. And so what it says right here, it says that she was about 65, waited about 25 more years, so she was about 90 years old. 90 years old and having a child. Listen, if we have any 90-year-old in here, let's not have any more children, all right? Let's not do that, all right? But here's the deal. She was well past the time when she should be having children, okay? Physically, it was just past it. It was done. She should not be having children any longer, well past that time. And remember in Genesis chapter 18, you remember when the angel of the Lord, when they come and they visit Abraham in his tent, you guys remember that? And tells him, you're about to have a child. When I come back next year, you're going to have a child. What did Sarah do when she heard that? She laughed. She laughed. Yeah, you're crazy. I know God told us that, but that was 24 years ago, right? I'm 90 now. Let's move past it. So she laughed. And he says, I heard you laugh. I come back in a year, you're going to have a child. And so what I love, this little verse right here, when it says, through faith, also Sarah herself, you know what that's referencing to right there? That's making reference to her laughing. That Sarah, even Sarah who laughed, even Sarah who struggled with that unbelief, even Sarah who laughed at this, look what happens. She received strength to conceive the child. God did everything. God's the one who opened her womb. God's the one who made her physically able to conceive and bear a child. Guys, let's think about this. I mean, that's a lot. She's a 90-year-old woman. 90-year-old woman has to be pregnant, right? That's not an easy thing. God did it all. God was the one who made her physically able to carry that child. God was the one who made her physically able to conceive that child and to give birth to that child. God was the one who made it all work. God's the one who gave her strength. He gave her strength. Listen, I want you to understand this. God's promises comes with God's resources. God's promises come with God's resources. He will supply all your needs. All of them. Even if it means supernatural means. God will supply all your needs. Why is it we can wait? Why is it we can take steps of faith? Because God's going to supply everything you need. Even Sarah, who laughed, God gave her strength. She received strength of God. That it was absolutely a work of God, absolutely a miracle. God did the work. She received strength. And so what I love is how that verse ends. It says, because she judged him faithful. She struggled with doubt in the beginning, but when she saw God work, she believed that God was going to be faithful to his promise. Her doubt afterwards turned to belief and knew God was faithful and had to believe that. Otherwise, she couldn't have a child when she was 90 years old. So she believed God was faithful. And so it goes on to say in verse number 12, it says, therefore sprang there even out of one. Okay, so out of that one was talking about Abraham. So it says, coming from Abraham, and look what it says. And him as good as dead. And him as good as dead. Now, that's kind of a dark little phrase right there, but what he means by that is he says that Abraham was as likely to have a child as a dead man at that point in his life, right? He said the percentage chance of Abraham having a child at that age of his life was the same as a dead man. Now, you don't have to be a mathematician. Those chances, those odds are very low, right? That's a 0% chance. And so everything that happened with Abraham was because God was faithful to his promise, right? He had about as much chance of having a child at that point in his life as a dead man. Yet, Sarah gave birth to Isaac when she was 90 years old. Why? Because God gave the strength. Because God was faithful to his promise. And so then it goes on. Look what it says. It says, so many as the stars of the sky and the multitude as the sand which be by the seashore, innumerable. That word is hard to say. I'm not going to say it again. But look what he says. God promised to make a great nation from Abraham. 75 didn't have any children. What did God do? God was faithful to his promise. And now he says he has descendants like the stars in the sky. When you walk outside tonight and you look up in the sky, look up at the stars, I want you to remember God's faithfulness to his promise. That's what God did. He says he has so many descendants, so many nations coming from him, like the stars in the sky. Because God is faithful to his promise. He says he's got more than the sand on the beach, right? more than the sand. You can't count them. There's too many. God is faithful to His promise. God is absolutely powerful and amazing. So how is it going to work? Through God's power. And then we get to verse number 13. We'll wrap it up with this. Verse number 13, he says, "These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." We're going to get to that in just a second. But look what he says. These all died in faith. None of the patriarchs, Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, saw the complete fulfillment of God's promise, did they? None of them saw that. None of them saw the complete fulfillment. They never lived in a city that was called Jerusalem. They never were able to have deep roots and say this is their home. They waited and waited, and even though they never saw it come to pass, they died in faith. They died in faith. Even in their final hours, they believed God was going to fulfill His promise. Even in their final hours, they believed God. How? We think about that in their final hours, they'd be thinking, well, this is it. Time's up. There's no more. But they saw God working afar off. They saw at a distance the blessings which God had spoken of. They got a glimpse of what God was doing and knew that He was faithful and that He was able to fulfill His promise. So even at their final hours and they're leaving the earth, they died in faith. You know what we call that? That's substance for things hoped for and evidence of things not seen. Even though they're dying, God's not done. God made a promise. God's going to fulfill that promise. God is faithful. And so it goes on to say they were persuaded of them. They knew, they were convicted, they were convinced that God would fulfill His promise. And so what do? They embrace them. They embrace them. I love that phrase right there. It literally means to enfold your arms around, to wrap your arms around. You hold tight. Everything they did because God made a promise and they believed that He would accomplish it. Guys, listen. As Christians, what is desperately needed right now is for Christians to embrace the promises of God. We need to embrace the promises of God, wrap our arms around them, and hold them tight. Listen, we say, I believe God. But when it comes to taking steps of faith, are we embracing those promises of God? Are we saying that, God, I know that You will provide everything I need, so I'm going to embrace that, I'm going to hold on to that, and I'll follow You, no matter where it leads me, no matter where it goes? Do I believe that this world is not my home, that You have something better for me? Am I going to embrace that truth, or hold on to the comforts of life? To hold on to what makes me feel safe and secure? Or are we going to embrace the promises and the truth of God? They were convinced of these things. They were persuaded of these things. And they didn't even see Him before they died. But they knew God was faithful. And they said, we're going to hold on to this. I'll embrace it because God is faithful. And they weren't going to back away from it. They were going to hold on to these truths. And so they confessed. I love that. They confessed they were strangers and pilgrims. They confessed, they acknowledged it. They accepted it. They said, hey, we are strangers. This is not it. This is not the end of the story. God has something more for us. God has made a promise for us. So I'm a stranger and I'm a pilgrim. I'm okay with that. Because this is not my home. This is not it for me. But you notice the last little thing he says right there. He says in verse number 13, strangers and pilgrims on what? On the earth. He wasn't just talking about Canaan right there. He wasn't just talking about the land of Israel, was he? He says we are strangers and pilgrims on the earth. He's going to keep building on this. Let's keep going. I love it. Verse number 14, look what he says. He says, for they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. Right? He says those who live this way, Those who walk by faith make something very, very clear. They accept that they're strangers, and they're very plainly saying, we are looking for a home, and this is not it. We are strangers on earth. This isn't it for me. This isn't the final total everything. It's not just I only live once, I'm going to live it up because this is it. No, this is not it. People who live this way say, this is not my home. I'm looking for something greater. I'm looking for something more. God has a promise and there's more for me. They're very plainly saying that. And in verse number 15, I love this. Look what he says. He says, and truly, if they had been mindful of that country from whence they came out, they might have had opportunity to have returned. Look what he says. If they had been mindful. What that means is if they remembered. It literally means to rehearse. If all they ever did was think about the country that they came out of. Right? Now listen. I got to confess to you guys. I'm a Texan. Sometimes I think about Texas. I think about Texas. But listen, if these patriarchs of the faith, if all they ever did was think about right? Think about Hanan, think about where they came from. First chance they would have got, they would have went back home. Right? That's what he's saying. And that's all they did was think about going back home, was remembering that and just thinking, oh, how much better it would have been there. But that's not what they were thinking about, was it? They were thinking about what God has promised them. What was the struggle with these Jewish believers? They thought about where they came from, right? They thought about what was comfortable to them. They thought about what they grew up doing. That's what they're thinking about. And so what are they doing? They're looking for chances to go back. Well, he says, guys, Jesus is greater. You have greater promises in Him. Don't be looking to go back. Faith says, I'm looking forward. Faith says, I'm pressing forward. Faith says, I got something greater. Faith says, this is not my home. That's not the end of the story. He is. And so here we come to verse number 16, which I absolutely love. He says, but now. Now, when he says but now right there, he doesn't mean at this present time. But remember, he's making an argument. So he says, as the case stands, right? I'm coming to the conclusion, and as the case stands, look what it says. They desire a better country. They desire a better country. They desire something better, a better home. Right? The patriarchs desire something better. Now that fits right in with the book of Hebrews, does it not? Jesus is better. And now what do? They desire something better. They desire a better home. And it wasn't just the nation of Israel. Look what he says. They desire a better country. That is a heavenly. You guys see that? They didn't just want the nation of Israel. They didn't just want the promised land. They desired something better. Jerusalem was not the end goal. They were confident that the land of Canaan would be given to their future generation. God promised He did. But for themselves, they were expecting a greater permanent dwelling, where they had been living in tents, not owning any of these lands, but God had something greater for them. And what is that? Heaven. That was not it. That was not the end of the story. They were looking forward to heaven. So what do we say today? Guys, this world is not your home. This isn't it. If that's all you're living for, can I tell you, you are missing the promises of God. So many people today, so many people say, I believe in heaven, I believe in the promises of God, but we embrace the things of this world and it holds us down. Why are we not taking steps of faith? Well, because this is my home. This is where I'm safe. This is where I'm secure. This is where I find purpose. This is where I find meaning. No, God has promised us something better. Embrace the promises of God. Embrace those truths. That's what these patriarchs did. This world was not their home. They were looking, waiting for something even better. And they knew God would be faithful. And so it says, the way it finishes it out, I love this. Verse number 16, it says, wherefore, because of that, because of their faithfulness and waiting for something better, God is not ashamed to be called their God. Isn't that an amazing verse? God is not ashamed to be called their God. Their lives glorified Him. And what is God doing now? Right now, God is testifying of their lives. He said, I'm proud of them. They walked by faith. Yeah, they struggled. They messed up at times. But they knew this wasn't it for them. That's what I want you to do. I want you to walk by faith. I want you to embrace these promises. God's saying, I'm proud. I'm not ashamed to be called their God. And to finish it off, he says, oh, by the way, for he hath prepared for them a city. That which they're waiting for, they're enjoying the fulfillment of right now. What they've been longing for, what they were waiting for, they're enjoying it. So we say to faithful believers who walk by faith, who say this world is not their home, who embrace the truth that at times that means suffering, at times that means doing things they don't know how it's going to turn out. That means doing things they don't know how it's going to end. They don't know what's going to lead them, and it might even not even see the fulfillment until they die. But God is faithful. And in this life or the next, God will fulfill His promises. God is faithful. They were looking for a home, for a better country, and now they're enjoying that. So where's Abraham right now? Enjoying the presence of God in a home that's far better than anything man could ever build. That's the hope that we have. It's the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's what they believed. That's what they embraced. So I want to give us two simple truths to wrap us up today. Got to go quickly. Two simple truths. Number one is this. Very simple. God will fulfill His promises. Absolute truth. God will fulfill His promises. God, by His nature, by His character, by who He is, He will fulfill His promises. We can know that absolutely true. What do we see? The entire Bible is proclaiming God is faithful. This is who He is. The entire Old Testament, the promises He made to the Old Testament to Abraham, what did He do? He fulfilled them. The promises we have in the New Testament, God will fulfill them. God is faithful. You can trust Him. God is faithful. And last is this. Embrace God's promises. Embrace them. That's what these patriarchs did. They embraced the promises of God. They held on to them and they wouldn't let them go. Guys, can I encourage you? Are you embracing the promises of God? Are you holding on to them and not letting them go? They didn't see them fulfilled till after they had passed away. But He says even in that, God is still faithful. God is absolutely faithful. And He will fulfill His promises. That's exactly what He did with Abraham. And now they're in a better country. The promises God has made you, God will fulfill. Embrace them. Hold on to them. That's what I encourage you to do this morning. If you would, with your heads bowed and your eyes closed, we're going to go into a time of invitation. This is an opportunity for you to respond to the truth of the Word of God. Whatever God may be doing, whatever God...